Chapter 35, from 1843 to 1847, Section 2. The development of the new convict system gradually disclosed its adverse character and excited general dissatisfaction and alarm. The press warned the people that an attempt to change the whole aspect of the colony from a free to a mere prison community could only be resisted by instant measures. Abolition of transportation was spoken of, although as a contingency rather than an object desirable, and a few only of the colonists were anxious to speed that event. Among these was Mr. Pitcairn, a solicitor of Hobart Town, a gentleman never before prominent in politics, but eminently fitted to lead the community on this question. The first petition of a series unexampled in number was drawn up by him and offered to the colonists for signature. All its allegations were supported by documentary evidence, drawn from the public records. The location of the gangs exposed them every moment to public observation. A frightful sketch of their distribution was drawn by the author of the petition. "If," said he, "you look at the last map of Van Diemen's Land, Mr. Frankland's, you will see at the entrance of D'Entrecasteaux's Channel, Southport. Here there are 500 men. Above, at Port Esperance, 400 men. Above this, along the banks of the Huon, the farmers begin. At Port Signet, up the Huon, there are 350 men. Proceeding up the channel, you come to Oyster Cove, 250. Brown's River, just above Worth West Bay and 5 miles from Hobart Town, 500. Taking now the main road from Hobart Town to Launceston, the lands on each side being all settled, fenced and improved, you will see Glenorchy, 8 miles from Hobart Town, 150 men. Bridgewater, 12 miles, 100. Cross Marsh, 30 miles, 100. Jericho, 40 miles, 100. Oatlands, 50 miles, 180. Ross, 70 miles, 120, and Cleveland, 86 miles, 250. At Perth, 100 miles from Hobart Town and 19 from Launceston, there was another gang, which was recently withdrawn. Leaving the main road, there are at the Broad Marsh 240 men. At Fingal, 400. At Buckland, 250. At Jerusalem, 500. At St. Mary's, 300. At Westbury, 200. At Deloraine, 300. At the Mersey, 200. In all, 20 gangs, comprising 5,500 men. The petition this statement sustained desired the most moderate changes, the reduction of the number transported to Van Diemen's Land to the standard of 1840, the amelioration of the discipline, the relief of the settlers from the expense occasioned by the presence of prisoners, and the gradual and total abolition of transportation. It was not adopted at a public meeting, but was published in several newspapers and deliberately signed by those who admitted its facts and joined in its prayer. Upwards of 1,700 persons attached their names, including 6 non-official councillors, 41 magistrates, and many other persons of influence. The committee who took charge of the petition requested the governor would testify to the truth of its allegations and the respectability of the petitioners. In few words, he promised compliance. He accompanied the petition with a despatch generally hostile to the object and unfriendly to the character of the subscribers, whom he described as men habitually factious, and who attributed their difficulties to any cause but the right. He asserted that their colonial property was trifling, and that they were encumbered with debt. He ascribed their discontent to insolvency and their embarrassment to extravagance and speculation. He disputed most of their statements, distinguished between them and the more respectable majority against them, and stated that the number of signatures was due to the indolent facility with which such documents were signed. This dispatch on August 1st, 1845, was printed for the use of Parliament, and soon came into the hands of the colonists. The absence of constitutional channels for the expression of their dissatisfaction led them to a measure which would otherwise be deemed an extreme one. Sir E. Wilmot was the patron of the Midland Agricultural Association, a body including much of the wealth and influence of the colony. They were convened by certain of the members, and the obnoxious dispatch was laid before them. An animated and indignant debate terminated in the removal of Wilmot from his place as their patron. No prudent colonist would desire to see this precedent often followed. The distinction between a governor as the head of the social circle and as the chief of a political body, will be more readily apprehended when his power shall be less absolute, and his secret advice no longer override the wishes and interests of the people. Having filled up the vacancies in the Legislative Council, Sir E. Wilmot called them together. It appeared that money had been provided and appropriated, and a pledge given to the bank to confirm the contract in the Council. It was intended to issue debentures and thus settle outstanding accounts. Messrs. Reed and Hopkins offered to this scheme a decided opposition, and being unsuccessful, they resigned their seats. The English government at length agreed to pay £24,000 per annum towards the police expenditure, but at the same time accepted the wastelands of the island from the general system. The land fund, elsewhere given up for the benefit of the colony, was assumed by the Lords of the Treasury. It was contemplated to employ convicts in clearing and cultivating, and by the sale of land to indemnify the Crown for the outlay. The governor was authorised by the Secretary of State to allot portions of land to ticket of leave holders, a measure offensive to the settlers in general and found to be impracticable. The Legislative Council passed several acts of great colonial consequence. The Abolition of Differential Duties Bill in July 1846 exacted the 15% ad valorem on colonial commerce in obedience to the policy of ministers. Thus the intercolonial trade was loaded with burdens of great severity, and in many instances it was cheaper to send raw material to London and import English than to exchange colonial manufactures. The measure was welcomed by some sheep-holding members as a tax on Port Phillip sheep, but the government disclaimed any other object than the increase of the revenue. A heavy retaliatory rate was then imposed by the New South Wales legislature. They, however, addressed their governor to obtain, if possible, a disallowance of the exactions of Wilmot. Messrs. Dunn, Orr and Stieglitz entered their protest against the bill and avowed the principles of free trade. A bill for electing commissioners of paving and lighting for the city of Hobart passed the council in August 46, and although disliked as an indirect scheme of taxation, was not unpopular. The first election under it occasioned a keen competition and considerable excitement. It was the first instance of representation, but the bill made no provision for a scrutiny, and the returning officer declared the poll against the protests of the defeated candidates. Many fictitious votes had swollen the numbers of their antagonists. The commissioners sat for some months and gave exemplary attention to their duties. But when the time came for rating the city, the defect of their election appalled them. This objection was long foreseen. An election without a scrutiny might not be founded on one valid vote. The government, unwilling to admit the defect of the bill, did not attempt to reform its details, and at length it fell into desuetude. A measure of still greater ultimate importance was enacted by the council, intended to restrict the increase of dogs. A heavy tax was imposed on the keepers of this indispensable protector of house and fold. The multitude running about the streets was felt to be a nuisance, and the destruction of flocks required some check. But the framework of the bill was objectionable and the charge excessive. It will be seen hereafter that the tax occasioned the most serious disputes. The administration of Sir Wilmot was, however, suddenly brought to a close. Reports, forwarded by Mr. Forster and adopted by the governor, extolled the outlines of Lord Stanley's system, while events were constantly occurring which, amply sustained by respectable testimony, demonstrated its sad consequences. Evils of a serious nature were extensively prevalent, some inseparable from every scheme of penal discipline, others aggravated by the excessive dimensions of the probation system, and not a few the result of the failure of demand for labour. The worst effects of sensuality were the most alarming feature of the system, but even they were probably only more flagrant because the extent of transportation gave them a wider range. Remedial measures demanded an outlay and inspection which the instructions of the Home Government had prohibited in language the most distinct. The ministers, having tied up the governor's hands, complained that he had carried economy to a pernicious extent, and in reporting the state of the prisoners had passed over important questions. But those who examine the dispatches of Wilmot with care will be compelled to question the accuracy of these complaints. There is scarcely an evil which the progress of the scheme unfolded that he did not admit and illustrate. These evils he thought partly accidental and partly inevitable in all penal schemes, but still he maintained that, With all its defects, the probation system, as such, was the best ever devised by the British ministry. Lord Stanley indeed stated that in 5 reports from Captain Forster and 17 dispatches from Wilmot, he had either received no intelligence or that their remarks were casual, slight, and few. Thus, at the end of 3 years, he found himself destitute of any clear understanding in reference to the conclusions which Mr. Forster, as the immediate agent, or the governor, as the chief superintendent, must have formed respecting the soundness of the principles or the wisdom of the plans which both had been called upon to administer in September 45. It was thus apparent that the Colonial Office held the governor responsible not only for obedience to positive instructions, but for their results, and that, in the event of a sacrifice being required, the officers on the spot would be devoted, and so it happened. In closing the session in September 1845, Sir Wilmot announced his recall. Although not usual then to address the council, he stated that he could not permit the members to disperse without acknowledging their assistance. A delusion for a time might expose a public man to popular injustice, but however misjudged, either during his lifetime or after death, his character would require no other vindication than truth would afford. He informed them that his recall was not occasioned by his differences with the late members, but was ascribed to an imputed neglect of the moral and religious welfare of the prisoners. And he added that the memory of their kindness would remain with him during the short remainder of his life. Mr. Gladstone, who had received the seals of office, conveyed to Wilmot the notice of his removal. The dispatch is a singular example of its author's mental habits. While he complained that the governor's statements were obscure, he gave his own views in odd and scarcely intelligible terms. Thus, the governor had adverted to the moral condition of the convicts in a manner too little penetrating. He had not made it a point of his duty to examine the inner world of their mental, moral, and spiritual state. Mr. Gladstone charged him with neglecting the vices of the stations, an error in judgment so serious as to render his removal imperative. These whimsical terms of reprobation excited universal astonishment. Practical men felt that the knowledge of the 30,000 prisoners, except by their conduct, to be ascertained by collating statistics, was rather more difficult than the hopeless task of similar investigations in ordinary life. The English press, with some truth and bitterness, described such demands as an encouragement of hypocrisy and religious pretense. No wise or good man will discredit religious teaching, but all such will look with suspicion, if not dread, and even disgust, on the statistics of prison piety, generally false and designing, in proportion as it is loud and ostentatious. The defects of the governor as a legislator were not taken into account. Mr. Gladstone, indeed, attempted to balance with much precision the merits of the patriotic six. He admitted that advice and assistance to the Queen might sometimes take the form of strenuous opposition to the executive. He denied the distinction between the offices of an elective and of a nominee legislator, between a council of advice and a representative legislature. He doubted whether Wilmot had properly calculated the difficulties which would follow the passing of the estimates, or the sympathy which the six would receive from the people. He censured mildly the accusation of disloyalty, but at the same time he stated the quarrel with the six was in no degree the cause of the recall. In his last address to the council, Wilmot alluded to the benign influence of time on a slandered reputation. This was soon after explained. Mr. Secretary Gladstone had accompanied the recall with a private letter which stated that rumours reflecting on the governor's moral character had reached the Colonial Office of a nature to hinder his future employment. Nothing specific was stated and no clue to inquiry given. Rumours had been long current, and they were spread with activity. The Atlas, a Sydney journal, compared the governor to the tyrant of Caprea and referred to his private habits with expressions of disgust. Remarks of a similar tendency appeared in a London periodical. It stated that the conduct of Wilmot excluded the respectable inhabitants of Hobart from his society and made it impossible for ladies to enter his house. This was instantly rebutted by Sir John Pedder and other official persons who declared their entire disbelief in these charges. Wilmot conjured Mr. Gladstone to state the time, place, and circumstances, the names of his accusers, and the exact nature of their imputations. In reply, he observed that the persons who mentioned these rumours did not profess to support their credit by any statement of particulars, but to found them on general notoriety. He added that it was not in his power to convey what he had not received. In the House of Commons, a fuller explanation was afterwards given, in a discussion raised by Mr. Spooner, a Warwickshire member. It was then stated that the authors of the report were persons in the service of the Crown, both in England and in the colony, and its effect, that the accused was living in scarcely concealed concubinage with several women. These preposterous imputations melted away the moment they were touched. Sir Robert Peel, an old neighbour of Wilmot, was highly displeased with the interference of Mr. Gladstone and pronounced the charges unworthy of belief. The eldest son of Wilmot appealed to Earl Grey for a formal vindication, but he declined expressing an opinion, although earnestly pressed, and excused himself by alleging that, independently of this charge, there was ample justification of the recall. It would have been no great stretch of generosity had a minister admitted that rumours set up as a bar to employment were no longer barriers to the confidence of the Crown. Mr. Chester, a brother of Lady Wilmot, transmitted an address presented to Sir Eardley to the Bishop of Tasmania for his remarks. He replied he could not tell to what reports it alluded and could not contradict them, but that rumours of the kind had fallen under his observation, which he had proved to be groundless. Charges had been whispered, but none had been substantiated in May of '47. The reports in disparagement of Wilmot originated in the freedom of his address, perfectly innocent in itself but liable to misconstruction. The credit they received depended entirely on the party sympathies of the listener, and they grew as they went. No one, however, attached much importance to them on the spot. Mr. Gladstone was condemned for entertaining them. He seems more worthy of censure for his indefinite method of stating their nature and the authority on which they rested. The moral character of a governor is of moment to a colony, and a just consideration in his appointment. But when assailed, it should certainly have all the protection of a full and open inquiry. No governor ever was more unfortunate in his political position. He could only tax and restrain. There was nothing in his gift. To the substantial difficulties of the people around him, he was unable to offer more than those general assurances which often exasperate rather than console. The state of religious parties increased his disquiet. He had to adjust the claims of churches to spiritual authority. In declining to erect ecclesiastical courts, Wilmot not only gratified many, but he followed the direction of his legal advisers. Sir Eardley Wilmot, like most governors, considered himself the servant of the Crown, restrained in his discretion by absolute and specific instructions. Had Lord Stanley acted with prudence, he would have left much to Wilmot's judgment. But just before he had dilated with vast perspicacity on the tendency of governors to act in behalf of the colonists, to forget imperial interests, to misapply the funds, and pervert the labour belonging to the Crown, the precision of his injunctions left no alternative but to obey. Had Wilmot at once declared the impracticability of Lord Stanley's schemes, he might have been recalled, but the responsibility of an utter failure would have rested with his chief. The interested reports of his subordinate officers unfortunately enabled him to hold out hopes of success, which were never realized, and to furnish an excuse for his condemnation. The governor was impatient of contradiction. He had been accustomed to debate, but the sarcasm which falls harmless on the floor of St. Stephen's Chapel in a colony cuts to the bone. He forgot that the head of a government can hardly say too little of men or measures. In a conflict of words, to an executive chief victory and defeat are alike pernicious. The usual order had been given that the governor, during his residence in the colony, should enjoy the complimentary distinctions of office. It was commonly understood that his stay would be prolonged, but he died soon after his retirement on February 3rd, 1847, in the 64th year of his age. The treatment he had received from the colonial office, and his death, far from the honoured sepulchre of his fathers and the scenes of his early political fame, produced a general sentiment of regret. All the houses of business showed marks of mourning. A public funeral, attended by the administrator and the newly arrived governor, was thronged by the citizens. It had been officially arranged that, except the ministering priest, the clergy of all denominations should walk in their several classes, but in one body, and the archdeacon, the moderator and the vicar general, as representatives of the three endowed churches abreast. The Anglican clergy evaded this plan by stepping up before the coffin. When, however, the bearers were in motion, the Catholic priests, by a rapid evolution, shot ahead of the procession. An ornamented Gothic tomb was erected in St. David's burial ground to the memory of Sir Eardley Wilmot. By subscription, it stands near the highway. His remains were interred close to the tomb of Collins. Sir John Eardley Wilmot was descended from the ancient family of Eardley of Audley, Staffordshire. He was grandson of Wilmot, Lord Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, a judge celebrated for justice and piety. Sir E. Wilmot was twice married, first to Elizabeth, daughter of Dr. Parry of Bath, and afterwards to Elizabeth, daughter of Sir R. Chester of Bush Hall, Staffordshire. Charles Joseph Latrobe, Esquire, Superintendent of the Port Phillip District, and subsequently first Governor of that territory, now called Victoria, superseded Sir E. Wilmot on October 13, 1846. During his short stay as administrator, he was employed in a careful scrutiny of the probation department. In performing this difficult duty, he displayed exemplary activity and decision. He resolved to remove every officer chargeable with incapacity or neglect, and thus many were dismissed. This promptitude exposed him to imputations of harshness, but although it is probable he did not wholly escape errors of judgment, the chief acts of his administration were amply vindicated by the facts he saw. The opinions he expressed sustained the colonial impressions respecting the convict system. While he suggested many improvements in its details, he concurred with the general wish for its extinction. Mr. Latrobe never met the Legislative Council, and his government, being limited to the established routine, left nothing to record. End of chapter 35. This concludes the period from 1843 to 1847.